All right, so I know I do a lot of videos on different things and audios, and I think this one was going to be a really good one that I wanted to get into, and that was doing a wax up of a crown and then taking it over to be cast or milled or whatever. But I guess the first step that I'm going to take is just doing it traditional way in this particular audio. Maybe the next audio I'll get into like how things are processed digitally, so you guys can get a feel for that as well. So the way it's done, let's go back to the traditional technique of taking a PVS impression. You are going to go to your chair, and then you're going to, take an impression and make sure that you guys have all of the information that you need in order to process the case. So, for instance, I need an impression prior to prepping the case so that I can have an idea of how I'm going to restore it. When we first go into restoring cases, it's always a good idea, and this is just a technique of how we've done it within the school and just in general. But how we do it is more so we take a PVS impression of the patient prior. If the patient's missing any dentition, then we can wax that up by hand. Traditionally, we would use actual wax and a Bunsen burner, and with a flame that comes out of the Bunsen burner, of course, and our waxing instruments. And so we would go from the wax to the flame, and then create a wax up of whatever teeth are missing. And then once you have that, then we can actually duplicate that model and then make that into, you can create a putty matrix index. You can create I know everybody, I stop when I say it, but I always say suck down because I'm just so used to using that word and that terminology. But a vacuum formed stent, in a sense, over top of your waxed up model, and then that way when you get to the chair and you want to start prepping, because then the patient accepted the treatment plan and they're A-okay and they're ready to go for their first crown. Let's say it's a crown, not a bridge, but if it's a bridge, just add additional units and add ponics. But if it's a crown and we go to that, we go to the patient and we start, the dentist starts prepping at the chair. Then once you've prepped that tooth, we need something to make a temporary off of. And that's where that wax up initially comes into play, is that we have that wax up with that stent. Now we can once we finish prepping, we can flow our temporary material, temp phase, whatever it is, whether or not you guys do putty kind of material, whatever you guys do, like mixing like the monomer polymer kind of resin, whatever is floats your fancy. But you can put that inside of that stent. Once you have the stent made, that's all you have to do. You put that into the stent. You make sure you lubricate the tooth with some kind of Vaseline or something so that the material doesn't stick to the tooth, because that's what happens a lot after you prep. So then you will put the stent on top of the teeth, and then after that, then you would remove it almost in this doughy stage. Once you remove it in this doughy stage, then you allow it to fully set. You sit it back onto the preps, and then work with it there and contour it and get it to where you want that temporary to be at. That allows you for the next steps to come into play. So once we got the temporary out the way, now we can start packing that cord. We pack the cord, just like if I was doing digital, I prefer you guys pack 2 cords. Okay, so double, triple, zero at the bottom, pack a larger one on top. That way I can see the margins. Now if and I say a larger one, I don't want it overlapping the margins or anything like that. I just want it to where we can see down inside by the tooth and the gingiva, so that we can get a good impression of the margin. Once we do that, then we're going to take our impression. So you use your sometimes you guys can use light or heavy or light or heavy, a heavy or medium body, and then you would use a custom tray, a triple tray, or a stock tray, okay, to do this. And then after you fit it in the patient's mouth, of course, and figure out which size you need, then you will apply a generous amount of your light body as a wash over top of that impression material before it sets, and then also in the mouth, and then blow a stream of air down there by the gingiva and the tooth so it kind of seeps in just a little bit more, and then go ahead and take that impression. Once you do that and you let it set and everything's good, depending on which one you did, if you need to take the opposing arch, then go ahead and take the opposing arch if you're using a stock tray or a custom tray. If you're using triple tray, you would have filled up the tray on both sides prior to taking the impression, so that you take an impression of both the upper and the lower. What that does is that allows you to have your upper and lower impression, but it also gives you a bite registration of the patient at that same time if you're using the triple tray. If you're using the custom trays or the stock trays, you have to take the upper and the lower, and you have to take a bite registration. So that's usually done with, I don't know, blue mousse or blue bite or whatever they call them. There's all different types of names, but a bite registration material to get that bite, that's in a separate step. So you do your or you do whatever arch you're working on, whichever prep tooth that you worked on, work on that arch first, and then go to the opposing arch, and then take an impression on that, and then take your bite registration. That's what your stock trays and your custom trays. Then once that's finished and you take it out, you look at it and you make sure that your margins are clear enough for the lab to see. Then the next step is for the lab you send it to the lab. You have to disinfect it and get everything ready, put it in your boxes and send it off to the lab. Make sure your lab scripts and all that are complete, be it in your systems, your online systems or your digital systems as on, in your office, or whether or not you guys are writing them up on a lab script. Once you do that, then it gets sent to the lab. Now this is where labs kind of get in it, and they, we do what we love. Okay. So after that, we're going to go ahead and pour up these impressions. Now, I will tell you, if you do take an alginate impression of the opposing arch, go ahead and pour that up. Don't send that through the mail because it dries out, okay? So it's best for you to go ahead and pour that up in stone. Do I always recommend it? No. The reason why is because the water-powder ratios can be off, and we want to make sure that the water-powder ratios are on. So I prefer it if you do a PVS of your upper and your lowers, and then send those. It's a little bit easier. I do like triple tray sometimes. It's just how I am, okay? So, because I like working in quads sometimes, depending on what it is. Not all situations are going to be good for that, and you have to make sure that certain things are followed when you're doing that. Make sure that you're not blowing through your trays and stuff like that. And I'm sure you guys heard that before. But anyway, so when the lab gets it, we disinfect it again and get it nice and cleaned and all that great stuff. After we disinfect it and we come through and we need to start pouring up the case. So what we'll do is, and I'll take you through on each one, but for each one, we basically mix up our jade stone or whatever stone that we're going to be using for the actual dyes. We'll go at that, it's a little stronger. We'll go ahead and mix that up, and then once we mix that up, and then like I said, that can be any kind of stone. It could be Fuji's high strength stone. It could be whatever I want to, but with low expansion. So we'll pour those up. We'll mix up the stone in the vacuum former. And then once it's in the vacuum former, then we take that and then we use the correct water powder ratio to mix it. We remove it and then we will spatulate that into our into your impressions. And we use vibration in order to get it into different areas. We also spray off those impressions before we start. Usually a debubbleizer of some sort will usually help in the flow of the stone throughout the impression. After that, we will go ahead and pin the models. There's different ways of pinning models. You can pin a model with, I think a lot of people understand, like using dowel pins, and then you place the dowel pins while the stone is wet. Or you can use like a machine like the Pendex machine, or there's different types of machine. Amon Girba has one. It's a pinning machine. All of them, they all have, like, there's all different types of manufacturers that have different types of pinning machines. You can also do it by hand, technically, to be honest, if you have the right burr and you know how to do it. Once you do that, then if you pin it while the stone is wet, and you know where to pin it based off of your markings on the impression. That's why you'll see like certain markings on an impression, because they're pinning it while it's wet. But if it's pinned while it's wet, then it automatically kind of cures to the pin. If it's pinned by means of mechanical pinning with the Pendex machine, or a Amon Girba Gyroform, or some of the other ones, or by hand, then we actually adhere the pin with like a cranial acrylic, like a super glue, into those areas, and then let them set that way. Once that is done, then we'll actually go back in and we'll spray those models on the side where the pin is with a separating medium. So once you put the separating medium on there, then that allows for the two stones to separate. So the next step is actually to pour a second stone and invert your models into that. We actually tease it in between the dowel pins, and then we invert it into our into like the base former, or you might, some labs, they can do it freehand. It just depends on how they do it. There's just different methods on how to do it. I prefer the pinning method with the base formers, but I can get around that too. So there's different ways of doing it. That one I'll say for a different course or a different time. But after that's done, then we break those out of the impressions. In between, when you're doing dowel pins, if you're pinning with a machine, it actually is removed from the impression and then placed back into the impression, to do whatever you need to do. Or it is just you just use a base former to do the second pour on those models. Once the second pour is done, then you're good. So then we take our articulators and we mount them. So depending on which way we're mounting them, whether it's on a fully adjustable articulator, a semi-adjustable articulator, or a disposable articulator. So there's all different kinds of articulators that are out there that are used for these, for doing what we do. To keep costs down, I know a lot of times we'll get into disposable articulators, but there's all different types of articulators that we can use. Once it's mounted, then we can saw and trim out the dies. So the dies are like the tooth that you guys prepped in the mouth. That would be where we would take and trim out that area, and then that'll be a removable die so that we can actually go to waxing. Kind of much like you did your stent, and then you're going to wax it. In our instance, we can take a dye, and then we're going to coat that dye. If we're doing it the traditional method, we can coat that dye with a I can think of it right now. It's like a paint. And this is so funny because it's in my head and I can see it right now. Dye spacer. We'll coat the dye with a dye spacer. We usually do 2 coats of our dye spacers, 2 to 3 coats of dye spacers, depending on what the microns are of the dye spacer. So each one, you can buy them in different microns, so different thicknesses. Once you have coated them and let them set and they're dry, then we put another separating medium on top of that, and also dye hardeners, and that'll actually strengthen that dye so that we can actually work on it. Some people like to wax completely on the dye without using a dipping pot. Some people like to use a dipping pot first so that we can establish like a coping of sorts, and then we might wax up to full contour if it's a full contour crown, like gold crown. Or if it's a coping, then we might dip it and then put the bands on it and then do cutbacks if it's a porcelain butt margin or things like that. We'll do all of those things first, and then once that's done, then we get all of them together, all the ones that we're doing. I mean, you can do one at a time, but if you're really trying to save time and do it efficiently, we do it in multiples usually. So once you do your wax up, then you have to sprue this wax up to a base. And this base is like a circular base, and then they have different sizes. In fact, they've got some that are oval and they got some that are circular. But this is where we're going to actually start investing our crown or our coping or whatever it is, our wax up of the teeth that we're going to be that we're trying to create for the patient. Once we've done that, we will go ahead and wax it to this form. So basically, there's a sprue that is connected to your wax up. That wax up then in turn from the other end of the sprue is connected to the sprue former. The sprue former has a surrounding that goes around it as well. So it contains, it's like almost like a container, but it contains the investment that you're going to mix up separately. We do that in the vacuum former as well, and use investment material. I'm trying to think. The investment material uses a certain liquid as well as water. Sometimes it just depends on the manufacturer. So you have to we gauge it by our manufacturers. And the manufacturers is based off of, what type of metal is it? What are we actually doing? And then once that's poured into the former, all around your crown or your coping and inside of it as well, without getting bubbles. And the way we don't get bubbles is that we usually spray like a debubblizer on that as well, and then that allows it to flow freely around it. And then we also use a vibrator to kind of agitate it so that we don't get the bubbles. Once it's set and dried, and it's hardened, then we put it into we break it out of that mold, and then we grind the top of the investment ring that's now a ring. You grind it a little bit to the top so that the gases are allowed to escape through the top. So you're breaking that initial surface, and then once that's done, then we put it inside of like a burnout oven. Once it's in the burnout oven, it goes through a burnout stage, and you can smell it, of course, but we have our vents and things on above where our burnout units are, so it kind of purifies the air a little bit, because it is a stronger ammonia smell that comes from these. But once it's burned out, then we can cast it, or we can press things to it. It just depends on what what you're doing. So if I'm going along casting a full gold crown or a coping, then I would get my metal ready and heat it up in a centrifugal casting machine. You can do these in induction casting machines as well as centrifugal casting machines. They all really work just about the same. So if you understand the way it's heated up and how you're supposed to heat up certain metals and not burn the metal and different things like that, then you can go to the next stage. Once you're done with that stage, then we flow the metal into the ring. Okay, so once it's flowed into the ring, it's allowed to cool. We end up breaking it out, breaking out the coping and everything that's attached to the sprue base, or the new sprue base, which is now an alloy instead of wax. But we break that out. Usually a hammer, some investments you can put inside of water and then it'll break. That's more so like gold crown with like beauty casts and things like that. You could do it that way. After that's done, we take it over to a sandblaster, sandblasts it off and make sure that there's no porosity, make sure that the casting looks well, and then we weigh up the metal. So we weigh up the metal before. Okay, we weigh up the metal after, when it's before the coping or the crown is cut off of the sprue, and then we weigh it up at the end, or after we cut it off. So we take a separating disc and cut off the coping or the crown from the sprue, and then the extra metal or alloy goes into our kits where we keep all the extra scrap metal, and then we reuse certain metals. So we keep those separate. So each metal is differentiated by what type it is. So we don't mix our metals, our alloys. After we've cut the sprue off, then now we can go to metal finishing. And once we go to metal finishing, then we can, and then, I meant to tell you this, the alloys are measured in DWTs, which is penny weights. So we have certain scales for that, and it can tell us how much it is. That's how we get our cost. And then once we have gotten into where we can metal finish it and get it nice and pretty and, polish it up and grind on it and make sure that it's seated on the die. We actually seat them on the dies that I told you initially we paint it with the die spacer. So we seat these on the dies and make sure that we have a good fit. And we do this under magnification. And then after that, it's ready to go. If we seat it on the die and then we seat it on the model and make sure that the contacts are right, make sure our occlusal contacts are and our proximal contacts are right, as well as our fit, then we're good. Then we have to process it even more. We have to polish it and then go through that stage. After that, then we sandblast the inside of, if it's an alloy type crown, we sandblast the inside of them with aluminum oxide on different strengths. It's just different powers of and that the manufacturers recommend for each alloy. And then we sterilize it and get it sent on out to our dentist. So that's pretty much all there is to and I think I even said this was about waxing, but this is about making a crown, from start to finish. What is it that entails at the chairside with the dentist, as well as once it gets into the lab and how it's processed. When you get it back from a lab and you're looking at a case, go ahead, push the dowel pin out. If it's a dowel pin, push it out. Inspect the margins. Make sure they're sealed. Make sure there's no openings. Put it back on the model. Make sure that the contacts, the interproximal contacts, are closed. Make sure that the contact for the occlusion isn't too heavy, or if you think you might want to adjust it before the patient gets here, go ahead and do those things. And then take it to the chair and then be done. We also provide like solid models. So once you have a solid model, you could put that on the solid model and see whether or not your contacts are closed as well. So that's one that we haven't changed it. That's a model that we haven't changed at all. We only just use it for our contacts. Whereas like a pinned model, a Pendex model with the dowel pins, they can sometimes move a little bit. So if you're not careful, or just sometimes the water potty ratio maybe just slightly off or something, and then so you have a little bit more movement in something than normal. So that happens. So there's ways to prevent it and different things that you can do, but that's pretty much it. That's how we make a crown from start to finish, and from the chair side all the way over to the dental lab side. How we check them when they get back to the dental office, and then seating them. If you have to seat them, you grind on them just a little bit with your burrs and of your burr of choice, and then usually slow speed tends to work pretty good on most of them, unless it's like a porcelain crown. Then use something like a high speed if you need to, but then go back in and smooth out those areas. If you have a good rapport with the lab, then you go ahead and you'll know what type of materials they actually are using. You might be able to keep that in the office. So if you need to add on, or if you need to glaze it and you feel comfortable doing that with their work, then by all means go ahead and do it. Now, we always say don't do it to somebody else's work, because you have no idea what it is that they used on there. They give you a roundabout of what they use, but you have no idea really, what temperatures they took it up to or anything like that, unless you're familiar with that side of things. So you run the risk of fracturing things if you run it up too high, or if you didn't, if you did something to it, inadvertently, but you did something to it that they didn't do. So it's always best to send it back to the lab that you actually got it from, if you need to add on a contact, if you need to glaze it, reglaze it, or something like that. If you want to just do a mechanical glaze, that's just taking your polishing wheels and just polishing those areas, and that's okay too. Just know that when you do that, you have more chances for plaque accumulation and different things like that in those areas where you polish, as opposed to if you sent it out to the lab to have it reglazed and then brought it back. So just be aware of those things, and that's all I've got for you. So I hope that helped.